Welcome to the walkthrough for the frequently made mistakes for assignment 2A. First and foremost, please make sure you document your code. Don't just provide implementations without explaining what your implementations are doing. Even though they're obviously implementing the specification, you still need to make sure you document each step. The next thing we'll take a look at are mistakes I saw in the various call methods. This call method here is too complicated. If you take a look, you simply have to return the being callable that the call is being made on. So that's actually very simple. Likewise, this implementation here is also too complicated. You don't need to make a new being callable. This call is already being made in the context of a being callable. So it's very simple to write. Down here, you don't need to make a new local variable, and you don't need to return that. You can make this much, much simpler. So don't write code like this. You can write much, much simpler code. Here's a piece left over from the previous assignment. This is acquire, palantir, and gaze. This implementation doesn't make any sense because it's iterating from I equals 0, I less than get gazing iterations and calling temp gaze every time through the iterations. I don't understand what that's even trying to do. Makes no sense at all. And this code here is incorrect because if an exception were to be thrown in the code above, then the release palantir method would not be called. And you have to make sure you follow the specification and ensure that release palantir will always be called even when an exception occurs. Now we're getting into the new assignment. So make sure that you initialize mFuturesList in a method rather than doing it at the field level of the class, because you need to make sure this gets reinitialized if the class is called again. This will only do the initialization once. And also make sure you use an array list, not a linked list. Likewise, make sure that you initialize the fixed thread pool in the method below, not in the field initializer section above. Same problem as before. If the class object gets reused, you'll have problems. Here's an incorrect implementation of the run simulation method. This method is quite simple to implement, but this implementation makes no sense. It's doing nothing at all. It doesn't implement the specification and simply waits for quite a number of minutes for the executive to terminate, which of course will not happen, so your program will simply hang. Here's a simple example of some additional code you don't need to write when you start using Java 7 or Java 8. You don't need to put in the type information inside of the template of the array list generic. You can simply say array list and then use the empty diamond operator in order to do that. Also, please, it's great to use streams, but avoid using for each. Instead, refactor your code to use collect here rather than for each. It's much cleaner. And in fact, we'll see in a second that there's some really serious bugs people keep running into over and over again because they're not using Java 8 streams, and instead they're initializing the future list incorrectly. This code here is a good example of what's happening. A lot of people had this bug. This is somewhat baffling to me because if you run the unit tests, they should flag this problem immediately because your code is going to blow up. So anytime you have code that's blowing up, you should be taking a look at the unit tests. They will help you to pinpoint what's going on here. And the main problem is you're not initializing mFutureList correctly. And in order to initialize mFutureList, it's really a good idea to get in the habit of using the Java 8 streams with collect, which will do all this initialization automatically for you, rather than you having to remember to write that into your code. Also, in places where you can use method references, make sure you use them. This code here, I believe, can use a method reference, and see if you can refactor it to do that. Here's a number of problems we have with the await completion of futures method. There was actually an incorrect comment in the original header for the method to describe what the method did. You don't actually need to make a new thread. So if you do make a new thread, it should work, but make sure if you make a new thread that you call join at the end of await completion of futures so that you wait for the thread to finish. That's why you don't really need a new thread. All the actual joining, all the actual concurrency is done at a higher level inside of the framework for the Palantir Simulator app. If you end up using a thread, which you don't need to, but if you end up using one, please use a Java 8 Lambda expression instead of an anonymous inner class. Inner classes are verbose and distract from what's actually happening. There's also another mistake here. Make sure that you use the get method on the future and not is done. Is done does not block, and therefore this implementation is not correct with respect to the specification, which said you may need to make sure that you wait for the future to finish, for the computation to finish and get the result of the future. Another thing, some people use streams in await completion of futures. That's great, but you don't need to reassign the futures list. You can simply do other things. You don't need to reassign futures list. It's no good to do that. Likewise, you don't need to do all these checks here in order to check whether the future's done or if the future's not canceled. Just call get. And when you call get, make sure you keep track of what it returns and then use that information, which should be a being, in order to be able to indicate what has happened and log it. And when you log it, make sure you log with the correct logger. It's the controller.log logger, not log.d. So please read the specifications for the implementation portions carefully. Here's a piece of code that the person said, they left a comment saying this code doesn't work. Well, the reason this code doesn't work is because it's missing something super important, namely the terminal operation. And for those of you who are learning about Java 8 streams, you always need a terminal operation in order to get the other intermediate operations within the stream to run. So if you don't have a terminal operation, then the other operations won't run. Here is another thing that can be improved. This actually has a bug, but you could fix the bug in various ways, but this code doesn't do it. So don't use the executor and submit a waiter runnable. Instead, just use a blocking call and get rid of the need for making runnables or threads. Here's a mistake in the shutdown now method. I have absolutely no idea how this method is even compiling, because it's saying mfuture.get.shutdown.now, which doesn't make any sense, because that should be returning a being, not an executor service, which has a shutdown now method. So take a careful look, make sure you understand what's going on. And this code is also an incorrect implementation of shutdown now, which doesn't implement the specification. If you take a look at the comment above, it says cancel all the outstanding being callables via their futures. And we've talked about how to do this in the earlier discussions about futures. There's a method that you can use to cancel something, but shutdown is not that particular method. And in fact, you don't want to be calling shutdown on the executor here. That needs to be called after the futures have been canceled in a method underneath that. So those were the most common mistakes that I saw. Almost everybody had something to improve. For those of you who didn't have anything concrete to improve, please see if you can use Java 8 streams instead of just using the other features like for each loops. And this is probably the single most common bug I saw that should not be occurring, the failure to initialize the future list. The reason that's happening, I think, is because people are simply not running the unit tests. So please make sure that you run the unit tests, and these kinds of problems should be flagged. If they're not being flagged, please let me know, but they should be being flagged. And once they're being flagged, you can go ahead and figure out how to fix them. Okay, so that's it for now. And we will talk about when the revisions are due, which will be when you submit the final version of assignment 2, or even better, when you submit assignment 2B, which will be in a week or so.